After the prohibition, believers continued their way of worshiping God, causing many individuals to be taken to court. Teacher Bailey, one of the first Baptist leaders, and many of his congregation from Perseverance Village appeared in court, charged by police officer Sergeant Paris with breaching the Shouters Prohibition ordinance. Caroline French was the first elderly woman charged with allowing the building of the Shouters house on her land. Charges were laid against Teacher Bailey and 13 others including Mary Brown, Augusta, Alberta, Jack for partaking in Shouters meeting. Teacher Bailey appeared in court with his head covered with a white cloth, a cross firmly pressed against his breast, and a huge Bible encased with red cloth. He refused to recognize the court's authority and would not plead either guilty or not guilty, but a guilty plea was recorded on his behalf. He contested the terms of the ordinance, which was based on the assumption that Shouters' practices did not constitute a religion. Sergeant Paris gave evidence, but the judge reprimanded and discharged all the defendants, with the exception of Teacher Bailey, who was held responsible for gathering and fined 5 shillings. He was also warned that if he returns, he would be fined £50 or sentenced to 6 months in prison. Teacher Bailey replied he had no money to pay the fine, but fellow spiritual Baptists offered to pay the fine as they would not allow their brother to go to jail. He left court with 200 followers of his religious persuasion following him.
In Trinidad, the Shouters Prohibition Ordinance of 1917 made practices of worship associated with the spiritual Baptists, also known as Shouters, illegal. This was because they considered the practices of bell ringing, adoption, shouting, catching power to be too noisy, too African, and seen as demonic, therefore uncivilized and unacceptable. It took effect after Gideon Morazen, governor of St. Vincent, fell from his horse to the ground while passing through a shaker's meeting. The horse, frightened by the singing and vibration from the shakers, jerked backwards and deposited the governor on the ground. Because of this, the colonial authorities were the view that a similar event could take place, so they felt it necessary to take steps to avoid such events. On November 28, 1917, the Shouters Prohibition Ordinance was passed against the faith in Trinidad and Tobago of such believers adhere it and would face hostility from the press and from colonial authorities who viewed their religion as vulgar, primitive, and inferior to European Christianity.
Over the years, other members of the spiritual Baptists were arrested, fined, or imprisoned. Teacher Patrick of Picton Road, Sandy Grande, was imprisoned for 3 months for performing a baptism in a river. Leader Roach, also known as Brave Boy, and his wife, Teacher Violet Roach, from Bel Air Road, were pelted with rotten eggs whilst preaching on street corners. Leader Harold Lakai Church was raided by police. He was arrested and charged. He spent a prison term because he could not pay the fine set by the magistrate. Leader Smith of Roxborough, Tobago, was beaten and arrested just as he was about to perform a baptism at San Juan River. These are among the hundreds who were beaten by police, arrested, and fined or imprisoned. The situation became so terrible that the Shouters had to devise ways and means of protecting themselves. To escape the police, a watchman from each group was appointed to notify the worshippers when officers were in the area. The watchman's duty was to shout,
Samson, the Philistines are upon you.
This continued for years until in the 1930s when Labour leader Uriah Buzz Butler called for religious freedom, including the repeal of the ordinance. The campaign was taken up by a prominent spiritual Baptist leader, Elton George Griffith, in the 1940s. In 1951, the campaign succeeded when the Shouters Ordinance was repealed. The spiritual Baptist religion, a form of African-oriented Christianity, developed in the late 19th and early 20th century, combining revival-oriented Christianity with African-derived practices of possession. In 1996, the government of Trinidad and Tobago made the anniversary of the law's appeal a national holiday, the Spiritual Baptist Liberation Day.